Daf Samach Daled Amud Aleph, in the middle of the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that there are three groups of Bnei Yisrael that come in and they are to do the Korban Pesach, and the process was that each group would come in, they would shech the Korban for brought in by the representative of each group. Each group had obviously a number of people that would eat that lamb or goat that night. The non-Kohen would shecht it, a Kohen would receive the blood, and then they would pass it to the next Kohen, and there were rows of either gold vessels or silver vessels. And that they would say Hallel, besides for what the Levim would sing Hallel, they would say Hallel as long as it took for the entire group's Karbanas to be done. Sometimes even a third time would be done, and in the third group, even the first one would not come to be complete. The next step was removing the skin of the lamb or goat in order to be able to get to the parts and get to the meat and take out the innards. So Ketzad Toilin Mafshitin, this is the third to last line of Samach Dalet Amud Aleph 64a. Ketzad Toilin Mafshitin, how would they remove the hides? So they would hang it up and on hooks. There were these hooks of metal that were set in the walls, and on the pillars, upon which they would hang the lamb, because it was so many that they would hang them and remove the skins, which is something that they would normally do just on the floor of the courtyard. They couldn't do that with so many lambs to do. So call me and call anybody that did not have a space on the hooks to remove the skins. So makles dakin v'chalok, and they would have smooth, thin rods that they would place on their shoulders. So first they would slide it through the knee of the lamb so that it would hang properly there, and then they would be able to rest it on each other's shoulders, two kahanim facing each other, or two people facing each other, and then they would be able to have enough leverage to pull down and remove the skin. And now we turn the page. That Rabbi Eliezer says that on Shabbos you couldn't do that. So Rabbi Eliezer Yudalet Shechalis b'Shabbos, we're in the top of Samach Dalet base of 64b. So the way we'd have to do it, instead of a rod, he would have to stick his hand through the leg of the animal in order to be able to rest it, and so he'd have his left hand on his shoulder of the body, and the person facing would do the same, his left hand, and they would put it on each other's shoulders, and this way they can use their right hand together to remove the hides. What would they do next? Once they remove the hides, so then they could open up the belly in order to remove the innards. And those would get burned on the mizbeach. So nasa b'megas, they put it inside of a large bowl, bektira, and they would put it al gabi mizbeach, and they would literally smokify it, burn it up on the mizbeach. So this was the first group, and they would leave, and they would sit on the Temple Mount. Shnia, this on Shabbos, so they couldn't go home yet. So the Shnia bechil, and the second one would be in the chil, which is the section, the sort of cordoned off section in front of the Beis Hamikdash. The third group, once they were done, would remain in the Azara until Shabbos was over. Chashecha, once darkness came, they would leave and roast their Korban Pesach. Of course, if it was a weekday, the first group can immediately go home and begin roasting their Korban.
Why did they have to hang around? They had an Eruv. Why did they have to hang around?
Well, for one, I don't know that the Eruv was always there. It's true that that the city of Yerushalayim had walls, that doors that close every night. I don't know what years that was, but there's another issue of a raw meat that they're not going to eat today. So that would be muksa. So they couldn't carry that home. They had to move it out of where it was, but it wouldn't necessarily be reason to go home. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. So Rabbi Yitzchak said, "Eina Pesach nishchat ela begimel kitos shel shloshim b'nei adam." It needs 3 groups of 30 each. My time, kahal ve'edav Yisrael. As we saw in the Mishnah, the Torah says, "Kol kahal adas Yisrael." It says congregation, community, and Yisrael. And Mesapkelad, and we're unsure if it means 3 minyan, 3 tens at one time, or does it mean 3 groups of 10, one after the other? Hilkach be'inon shalosh kitas. So therefore, you need 3 groups. Shal shloshim, and each group has to be 30 because maybe each group has to be 30 because you need 3 minyan. So if you need 30 at once, you had 30 at once. And if you needed them subsequent to each other, you have that too. Now, really, in truth, it would be sufficient to just have 50 people, 30 in the first group, and then the korban is done for 10, and they leave, and the next group arrives of 10, and so you still have 30, and then the next group of 10's korban is done, and then they leave, and another group of 10 come, and this way you'd have 3 groups of 30, but also 30 at any given time. The Eilit Lassen, the Avdi Eili Asara, Vanafki Asara, Eili Asara, Vanafki Asara. So it could have been done this way as well, but obviously there wasn't the time that there were only 50 people bringing a korban in Pesach, so they did it in as many fit in the first, as many fit in the second, and at least 10 in the third. By the way, when I said as many fit, really it should not fit at all. It was a tiny space, just 1,000 square, less than 1,000 square yards. Nevertheless, it fit an amazing amount of people. The first group came in. Itmar Abai Amaninel. It says that once it was filled, the doors closed. So Abai says they closed on their own. And Tanan. Now Rav Aman Noyal in Tanano, there was an obligation of the Kohen to close it. My Menayu. So what's the basis of their machlokas here? Should they rely on miracles, even though we just said that it was miraculous that they could fit people in at all? But this was a question of whether the responsibility of closing the door is a miracle that they should rely on, or they should do their responsibility and whoever fit. As many fit, and then let the doors close on their own. Rav Amanuel and Tanada, they actually closed the door at some point. He said they didn't rely on the miracle of the doors closing on their own. Vatanan, Amar Yehuda, and this is what we learned in regards to the Akavi B'Malal episode, where there was a question about a certain the waters of Sota in a certain case, and Hanani ben Akavi said it was not real Sota waters. They just did it for show, and there was a question of whether he was excommunicated or not. So Rabbi Yehuda said, "Chas v'sholem shakavim malala nisnada." We should silence such as a rumor that Akavi Malal was excommunicated. Shein azaron and elas al kol adam b'Yisrael b'chachma v'yirascheit k'Akavi Malal, because the doors of the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash would never close on Pesach when there was so many people there. It would never close on anybody more wise and more righteous than Akavi Malal. He was a great person. In any case, saying for that story, Rabbi Yehuda was saying that he was clearly a great person and there would not have been any excommunication of him. But what we see is that he uses the term, the doors didn't close, meaning reflects it by itself. So Abaye metaras hatamei v'Rabba metaras hatamei. Abaye metaras hatamei in azar b'shosh shenunal al kol adam yisrael b'chacham yimiras chayk kakav melal. There was never, when it closed on its own, it never happened that there was somebody greater than Akavi Malal. Al Rava metaras hatamei in b'azar b'shosh shenoyal enoisa al kol yisrael b'chacham yimiras chayk kakav melal. And there was no one as great as a Kav Melal. And when they closed the door actively and on Erev Pesach, when they would close the door on each group. Tanu Rabbanan, the Brisa taught that in spite of the fact that there were so many people trying to get in and squeezing in, the person never got trampled or crushed in the Azar in the courtyard. Besides for one of the Pesachs that happened in the days of Hillel, that one elderly person became trampled or crushed. Pesach Mu'uchin. They called it Pesach Mu'uchin, the crushed or trampled Pesach. Tarabanan. The Brisa taught it differently. One time, Bikesh Agrippas HaMelech, Agrippas, the king, wanted to do he was a Roman proxy Jewish king, and wanted to do take a census of how many Jews there were. Now, the idea of counting Jews is not something you can do. David HaMelech tried it, didn't end well, and so we don't do that. So he sought the advice of the Chachamim of what to do. So he said to Kohen Gadol, check how many Korban Pesachs there were. Not al kulim and kol echad v'nimtzu sham shishim ribi zugei kiloyas. He took a kidney from each one and found that there were 600,000 pairs of kidney, meaning 1.2 million Korban Pesachs. Kiflaim kietz Mitzrayim, double the amount of people that came out of Mitzrayim. And that excludes the people that were tamei or were at a distance and couldn't make it in. Meaning that were some people that didn't participate in the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan and would have to do it on the 14th of Iyar, and so this 1.2 million Korban Pesachim were besides for the people that were not counted. And every Korban Pesach itself has a group of some 10 people, which means that there are about 12 million Jews participating in the Korban Pesach, and that's including elderly men, women, children. So they called it the thick or the fat Pesach because there was so many people counted there. No, so now the Gemara challenges the story. Says, wait, the Kohen Gadol would take a kulya, one kidney from each one of the karbanos, not a kulya v'aktura. But we said in the Mishnah it has to go in a bowl that gets put on the mizbeach to be burnt up. The other maktilu. No, he would then put it back in the bowl and bring it on the mizbeach. But it has to be each one separately. You can't mix them up. The other maktilu chada chada, he would bring them individually. But it has to be all as one. I say you're right. It didn't mean that he actually took them and then put them back. Ella tafisa ba'alma. He wouldn't hand them. That's not the way they did the count. In Roman days, counts were usually done by putting a pebble in a bowl or in a jar, and so this is what was done as well. Ella tafisa ba'alma the shakaminayu chad yavile midi achrin. So the way it would be done is that the census taker would put a pebble in for each time that the Kohen would lift his hand with a kidney, and then he knew that's another one, and he would put a pebble into the jar, and that's how they made their count. But they didn't actually take the kidney away; it was just lifted up in the air to show the people taking count that another one had been done. So what's the reason for a row of gold, a row of silver, a row of gold, a row of silver? So the Gemara first thinks that there's some halachic reason that when you're taking, if you're holding a gold vessel and passing it to the Kohen full of the blood that goes to the Mizbeach, and then you get back a silver one, so you're diminishing your service. And we know as a general rule, you don't go down to a lesser service, and if you downgrade him from gold to silver. That's why you only had rows of gold or rows of silver. That's what the Gemara first thinks. My time. Ilema the Dilma Shakli Dava Mailing the Kasma, maybe he's gonna put down a gold and take a silver. But it could also be that there's a lower amount of weight as well. Ella the Hachay Shabbat. So it has nothing to do with the halachic issue of Malam Kodesh. Of course, the entire time you're doing the service, they're equal in the service. Rather, the reason is because it's beautiful. It's nicer to have a row of gold vessels moving back and forth and a row of silver vessels moving back and forth, and that was a part of the beauty of the service. And these bowls or these vessels that they were passing back and forth didn't have a flat bottom so that they couldn't be put down so that the blood not become congealed. The Chachamim said that all of the vessels like this in the Beis HaMikdash did not have flat bottoms, besides for the frankincense bowls that were set on the table by the showbread, by the lechem apanim. Because if it was a rounded bottom and it would lean on the breads would break. The breads themselves were not just a flat piece of bread or a loaf. They actually were made to look like the shape of a U or a V. They had a bottom and sides, and since they had sides as well, if you lean a vessel of frankincense on the sides, they could break and collapse inward, and so therefore the bowls were not made to lean with a rounded bottom, or rather a proper flat bottom, so they would sit on their own and not break the showbread, the lechem apanim. Shachat Yisrael v'kibel hakohen. Now it says in the Mishnah that the Kohen would receive the blood after a Yisrael, a non-Kohen, shechted. The Gemara says, wait, it has to be that a non-Kohen shechted? The Gemara is going to tell us, no, this is hinting to us that a Kohen is not required to do the shechting. The part of the Kohen is only from the receiving the blood and onward. It's not enough meaning it has to be a non-Kohen. Gufa kamashmal and the shchita bazar ksher. No, it's just telling us that a non-Kohen is allowed to do the shchita, the slaughter, the kibul hakohen, and the receiving of the blood by the Kohen is hakamashmalan mekabel of elach mitzvahs kohen. From the receiving of the blood onward, it's a mitzvah of the Kohen. And then he would hand it off to his friend, and which tells us that bringing it close to the mizbeach does not require walking it there. It's enough to just pass it off one to the other. But Mahu says maybe that each one would take a step over a little bit. So that rather, what's the chiddush? Why does the Mishnah say that they would hand it off from one to the other? It's telling us another teaching that there's a glory to the king when there are masses. So it is nicer to do a mitzvah in public or in conjunction with a lot of people than to do it alone. There are many halachas like this For instance, reading the Megillah, one of the halachas is that if you have a minyan of 10 versus a minyan of 50, it's better to go to the minyan of 50. Whenever you can do a mitzvah together with a larger group, that in and of itself is a beautification of the mitzvah. In the Mishnah, it says that he would receive the full vessel and pass it off, and in return receive a empty vessel. But it says it in this order specifically. First receive the full vessel and then receive the empty vessel. Rabbi Shimon Lakish concurs with Rish Lakish, who says, if you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, don't pass over it. So you have the opportunity to receive the full vessel or receive the empty vessel. The full vessel is in the midst of a mitzvah. And the empty vessel is going back to do to be available for the next mitzvah. So you're going to receive that first. As we talked about, they pass across their body, so they would receive with one hand the full vessel from the Kohen on one side and begin passing to the other side while taking the empty vessel and passing it back, and so crisscrossing their hands across their body and passing it back and forth. The Kohen that was closest to the Mizbeach, he would spritz the blood on the Mizbeach. So, Mantana Pesach Bezrika, who says that the Pesach is by spritzing and by pouring it on the Mizbeach. The opinion of Rabbi Yisrael Glili, the Tani, as we learn, Rabbi Yisrael Glili, as their bloods shall be put on the Mizbeach, and shall be thrown on the Mizbeach, and their fats should be placed to be burnt on the Mizbeach. And this is the idea that the pouring of the Mizbeach, of the blood, doesn't just get poured along on the wall, but actually gets tossed, spritzed from a distance. And we learn this from the teaching by Bachar, by the firstborn animal carbon, where it doesn't say its blood, but its bloods, or their bloods, plural. And from that we learn, it doesn't say singular, it says it in the plural. It doesn't say the singular of the fats, but plural. So that since it says it in the plural, almost every carbon, it says specifically how to place the blood. But there are the Bachar, as well as the Tai, the Maser, and the Pesach, which are Kachim Kalam and minor Kachim, and similar in many ways, and they are there. It doesn't say what to do with the blood, and since it says a plural by the Bechor, it indicates that that's to tell you that the Pesach and the Maser also gets the same spritzing of the blood and the fats burnt on the Mizbeach. And how do you know that it has to be on the Mizbeach and an area that there is a base to the Mizbeach, as we talked about yesterday, that the blood was spritzed on the eastern side of the Mizbeach, above the section that had a base, because not the entire there wasn't a base for the entire eastern side of the Mizbeach. And since we learn it from there, from the Bechar, there it says specifically that they would throw the blood, spritz it on the Mizbeach. Pesach Nami, so just as an oila offering and a scent offering requires the base, so too over here it requires a base. Now we go to Samachem Aleph 65a. And how do we know the oila requires that there should be the base at that area? To the base of the oila mizbeach. So that tells us that the name of the mizbeach is the oila mizbeach, and you have to spritz it at the base to tell you that the oila requires a base. So Mishnah says that they would repeat this for the first group, and then repeat it for the second group, and repeat it even for the third group. Tana, we learned in the Brisa, Hinikras Kat Atzlanis. The third group is called the lazy group. V'halei Sagi, the lav hachi, but you can't not have a third group. So what's this about? What should they have done? Still, they should have been diligent to try and be in the first group. Because the Tani we learned, Rabbi Yossi says, the world needs spice makers, and they need people who work with tanners who work with hides. Even though that somebody who works with spices is going to smell better, and someone who works with hides is going to really not smell that great. Asher mishum nasib basam of oila mishum nasib bursi, and fortunate is the one that can be a basam, a spice maker, and woe to the one whose work is to be a tanner. The world needs both males and females. Asher mishum banav zcharim. Fortunate is the one whose sons are male. And woe to one whose sons or children are female. And this is not a social commentary for postmodernism. This is the idea that there are more mitzvah obligations where somebody can teach their children. Obviously, the world needs males and females to continue. The same thing that was done on a weekday was done on Shabbos. However, as we saw yesterday in the Mishnah, they would plug the stream that came into the Beis Hamikdash, which would then overflow onto the floor, the stone floor of the courtyard, and it would be a washout. However, the Mishnah says this was shalibrit chachamim against the will of the chachamim. Shalibrit man, which chachamim were opposed to this idea? Rav Chisda shalibrit Rabbi Eliezer. So Rav Chisda says the idea was opposed by Rabbi Eliezer because he said that he held that this washing of the floor is a Torah prohibition, the Rabbanan, because if it's just a general opinion of the Rabbanan, that would not be a problem. Ha'abri shvusu, because they say that it's a rabbinic enactment not to wash floors on Shabbos, as we'll see momentarily. Ve'en shvus b'mikdash, and there's no in the Beis Hamikdash rabbinic enactments did not take effect because they wouldn't make it for the Beis Hamikdash because it was necessary to do the service. So what's this basis of Rabbi Eliezer, the Chachamim? The Tani we learned. Somebody who milks a cow. So that's an extraction of a liquid from within a solid. And that would be a Torah prohibition. And somebody who puts something acidic into the milk in order to separate to curdle it, and by doing so separates, creating a Torah, one of the 39 principal malachas of separating out or selecting the good from the bad, and over here or bad from the good, and here he's creating that separation within the milk. And somebody who then takes those kernels and forms them into a cheese, which is constructing by making something solid out of small pieces. Krogergeres, even the size of a fig size, would be a Torah transgression. And amachabed, somebody who sweeps the floor. V'amarabetz, and somebody who sprinkles water on it to keep the dust down. V'haridechales dvash, and somebody who extracts the honey from honeycombs. B'shogeg b'Shabbos chayv chatas. If he did so inadvertently on Shabbos, not knowing that it's Shabbos or not knowing it's prohibited, would bring a sin offering. And if he did so intentionally on a yantiv, he's going to get lashes. That's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer says all these are Torah prohibitions. The Chachamim say no. These are similar to Torah prohibitions, but they're not actually Torah prohibitions. These are rabbinic enactments on account of that they look like and act like and feel like Torah prohibitions, but they're not. In any case, so if that's the case, in the washing out of the floors in the Beis Hamikdash would not be a Torah prohibition. It would be a rabbinic prohibition, according to the majority opinion, that you're not actually smoothing out the floor when you sweep and when you wash out. You're not actually doing any construction, especially if it's a stone floor in the Beis Hamikdash. It would only be similar to the kind of work that somebody would do when flattening the ground before a construction project, which would be a preparation for that, but it would nevertheless not be a Torah prohibition. However, this could even be against the will of the majority opinion here, which says it's a rabbinic enactment. And even though we generally say Ein Shvus B'Mikdash, that the rabbinic enactments were not made for the Beis HaMikdash because the Kohanim have to do their service, Rabbi Nassan, nevertheless, this is the opinion of Rabbi Nassan, the Tanya Rabbi Nassan, that the Chachamim only allowed that a shvus, a rabbinic prohibition in the Beis HaMikdash was allowed if it was necessary for the service. This was not necessary. You didn't have to wash out the floors on Shabbos, and therefore it was prohibited, or at least the Chachamim were not happy with the Kohanim doing it. Rabbi Yehuda said in the Mishnah, the last part we saw yesterday in the midst of the Mishnah, that Rabbi Yehuda said that from all of the blood that had collected on the floor of the Mizbeah of the courtyard, from the hundreds and hundreds, or really we saw thousands or hundreds of thousands of carbon pesachs that they brought, they would collect one bowl of blood and spritz it on the Mizbeach in case somebody's blood had been missed. So Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda said that they would fill a cup from the blood mixed on all the blood mixed on the ground. If the blood of one korban had spilled without making it to the mizbeach, this would sort of cover it and allow them to eat their korban. Rabbi Yehuda said, I don't know what you're talking about. If it got spilled, it never was received in a vessel. If it was never received in a vessel, it's missing step one of that service. Ella hachikami. Yeah, you wouldn't know of it. So therefore, he said, that maybe it didn't get into a vessel. Not that for sure it didn't, but maybe it didn't. Okay. You're right. I'm talking about at least one that did make it into a vessel and then got spilled onto the ground. At least now it would fulfill the obligation. So how do you know if spilled or not? Kahanim's reasoning. The Kahanim are diligent. And so is reason on my mishtapech. So then why did it spill at all? Since they were working so quickly and they were doing this, with a lot of karbanas very quickly. So some of it could have spilled. So, but it's not really the correct blood. The receiving of the blood would be the first initial squirts of blood that came out, which essentially are the dying, the blood that sort of kills the animal, and the rest of the blood that seeps out afterwards is daramatams, the blood from the center of the body, as it were, and that's not the part that would go on the mizbeach. So you have all that blood mixed on the floor of the courtyard. Well, first of all, Rabbi Yehuda follows his own opinion, who says that actually is sufficient. It does count as proper blood. The Tanya, as we learned, in regards to the prohibition of eating blood, that damatams is ba'azara, that the first blood that comes out, that's a kares. If somebody drinks that, they would, that's the soul of the animal, as it were, the life force of the animal that came out, because that's what the animal died with. And somebody drinks that is going to going to be kares. Their soul is cut off from its source. However, the blood that comes afterwards is not going to be mikaris. That's going to be just azhara, a regular prohibition. However, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Hikaris know that even the blood that comes later is also karis. So you see that he holds that there's no distinction, and the initial bloods and the blood that comes afterwards is both are a Torah prohibition that has kares, the soul cut off from its source, for drinking it. So Gemara says, no, you can't say that's what he means, that this works for him, because even though he says that in regards to the prohibition of eating it, they're equal, the first bloods and the later blood, but in regards to the spritzing on the altar, what would cause affect atonement and essentially complete the process of the korban, that only the blood, the blood that comes out first, only the dam nefesh is going to be valid. Ki shenemar, as it says in the verse, ki adamu benefesh yechaper, because the blood, which is the soul of the animal, yechaper will atone. So you see that it needs to be that initial blood. Now we turn to Samachem at base. Dam shenefesh yotze bemechaper, dam shenefesh yotze be'enemechaper, and it tells us that the blood that the animal's life force leaves it. With the blood coming out, that's going to be the atonement. That's what goes on the mizbeach, and the other blood's not. So now you have a mixture of the all this blood, and this is going to make it on the mizbeach. It's not a valid spritz. You're spritzing blood that isn't valid. Ela Rabbi Yehuda l'tami. So rather, this is based on another opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in regards to nullification. Generally, we say that items would be nullified either in majority, 1 and 2, or there's a nullification of flavor in 1 in 60, or we found 1 in 100, 1 in 200 for more severe prohibitions. In regards to something that is not nullified, even 1 drop in 1,000 would not be nullified. And so this blood, if you hold that the blood of one korban does not become nullified in the blood of another, so when you have this entire mixture, even though that you don't technically have in every cupful a molecule from every animal, but since they all count as one entity, because it's not nullified one in the other, if you take 1 cup of blood from the ground, that would essentially count as all of the carbonates in there, because it's not nullified, even though you don't necessarily have physically the blood of each carbon in that cup, but the entities counts as one entity because nothing's nullified. So Rabbi Yehuda follows his opinion that Amar ein dam mevatel dam, that blood does not nullify blood, and therefore when he takes a cup from the ground and spritz it on the mizbeach, essentially every carbon that's in there is going to count as being spritzed on the mizbeach. Tanya, the Brisa taught, Rabbi Yehuda said to the Chachamim, according to you that you say that it's worthless and that they're nullified. So why was it that they would plug the drains in the courtyard and all the marble floor, the stone floor was covered with blood and it wouldn't just drain out? So the reason was because it is a praise and a glory for the Kahanim on Erev Pesach, when there's so many karbanos, to be walking up to their ankles in blood. So Gemara says, wait, but they have to be walking on the floor of a kachayitz, and it's a barrier. It's a chatzitza. So Gemara says, no, it's not a chatzitza lahu. While it's still wet, it's not a chatzitza. It's not a barrier. It's kedetanya, as we learned, hadam, blood, vidyo, and ink, v'cholav, and milk, vadvash, and honey or nectar, yaveshim. If they dry out, chetzitzin, that's a chatzitza. Lachin, while they're still moist, ain't chetzitzin, it's not a chatzitza. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. Welcome, it's davi manayu, but their garments become dirty. Tanya, we learned if his garments were messy and he did the service, it's going to be invalid. If you say that they lift up their vessels, but Tanya, we learned it has to be the full length. It shouldn't be too short, shouldn't be too long. So Gemara says you're right. This is the bringing the parts onto the altar, which is not a service, and then he could walk in the blood. For the rest of the time, he wouldn't walk in the blood. Well, since the Kohen is the one that has to bring it on the altar, it must be that that's a part of the service. The Tanyas will learn, the Kohen has to bring all the parts onto the altar. This is the bringing of the limbs on the Mizbeach, Lakevish to the ram. You're right. We're talking about that the Kohen would walk in the blood and lift up the bottom of his garments in order to be able to walk in the blood. This is by bringing the wood for the pyre onto the fire. The lav avodah, that's not avodah. That's not a part of the service. But for the rest of it, how were they able to walk? They would go on top of stone platforms, which are considered part of the floor. Now, even though obviously it was impossible for them to do so much service with shechting, which would spritz blood on them, and the holding of the parts, which would spritz blood on them, there's no way that their white linen garments were completely clean. So what does the Gemara mean? And the Chassam Sofer explains that that's a part of the beauty of the service, that it looks like the mitzvah is being done. However, the bottoms being soaked in blood, that would not be nice. And he points that similarly, somebody holding an esrog on Sukkot, right? The first day may be beautiful, but when you hold it day in, day out for shaking and for the Hallel and for Hoshanas walking around, so essentially it starts getting brown spots from a person holding it. So you'd say, okay, so the esrog's not so nice anymore. Of course not. That's the beauty in and of itself, that you're doing the mitzvah and that the mitzvah has indications of the mitzvah being done. So the Mishnah continued and said, how do you hang it to skin it? So they would hang it and skin it. And then it says, they would open up the body to remove the innards to bring it up on the mizbeach. He himself would had to bring the Kohen who did that had to bring it up on the mizbeach to burn it. Rather, he himself, the owner who would be skinning it, would have to burn it. No, somebody else, the Kohen, would be the one to do it, but he would put it in a bowl in order to have the Kohen preparing it for the Kohen to bring on the mizbeach to burn overnight. The first group went out, the second group came in, etc. The way they would do it is, in order to bring the lamb back into town, they would take the lamb whole and put it inside its hides itself, and use and sort of turn the hides into a burlap sack, like a cloth, a hides, right? And they would use that as a sack and throw it over their shoulders, the acharav, and this is the way everybody was walking back into town, carrying their lamb or their goat in its hides back into town. Omer of Elosh, or of Elosh said to Ayos, like the merchants would walk from town to town. Yashikach, wishing you a great day.